Sit back and take a breathtaking journey to the untamed heart of our world. A world where life is mystical and death is often brutal. Where instinct and ritual form an enduring game. And where survival is the greatest battle of all. Welcome to the Survival Wildlife Series, one of the most highly acclaimed award-winning documentary series ever produced. Traveling to the far corners of the earth, camera teams risk their lives to bring you this rare and unique footage. The Survival Wildlife Series is now yours to buy and own on video. Collect one or the whole series and build your very own library collection.
Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry of gladness. Many miles to travel through the day and night, heading for the Southland, ever on your flight, fleeing from the north wind, down across the state, down to where the sun shines. That's where my love awaits. That's where my love awaits. Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry flying home to me.
Last time I met Glenn Campbell, he was singing in aid of wildlife. My own interest in wild geese is fairly well known, and so I'm delighted we can get together to tell the story of the lesser snow goose. In spring, the long straggling skeins of snow geese forge northwards to their Arctic nesting grounds. It's late May, but up here in the far north, spring hasn't yet arrived. Much of the land beneath the geese still matches the snow white of their wings. They're well named snow geese. Snow governs the rhythm of their lives. They can't nest on their Arctic breeding grounds until the snow retreats, usually in early June. And they must raise their young by the time the snow comes again in September. They're headed for one of the most desolate parts of North America, the tundra to the west of Hudson Bay, where the McConnell River spills out in a 2-mile-wide delta. This year, just before the snow geese arrive, a plane lands on this barren place. The geese will be lingering to the south, knowing by some uncanny instinct that the snow hasn't cleared from their nesting grounds. Aboard the plane are Des and Jen Bartlett, Australian naturalist camera team, with their nephew Les and their friend and assistant Lee Lyon. Apart from a handful of scientists, they will be the only people to share the empty tundra with the snow geese. Everything they need for the next 4 months must be flown in. The plane takes off to fetch another load of stores. The Bartletts have had to plan their supplies like a military operation. If they've forgotten anything now, it's just too bad. After one more trip, the plane won't be coming back. It may not look much like home, but that's what it's going to be for the Bartletts for the next 4 months. Just a drafty tent on the tundra. Amid a flurry of snow, they set up house. The ground is still too frozen for Des to drive in tent pegs, and so he ties his guy ropes down to rocks. Almost at once, they experience one of the most engaging things about life on the tundra. Its wild creatures are so trusting. These willow ptarmigan immediately begin to share their campsite with them. The first sign that spring is really on its way is the break-up of ice in the McConnell River. On the 23rd of May, the great day dawned. The first reconnaissance squadron of geese flew over the still snow-dappled tundra. Among the snow geese, a few Canada geese. With this pair, there's a blue goose, not a separate species, but a colour variation of the lesser snow, known as the blue phase. In the next few days, the geese kept coming in earnest. Some sandhill cranes flew with them. They nest up here too. And all these birds were driven by the age-old pressures that tell them they have only a short time in which to raise a new generation. They're impatient to land and settle down to domestic life. Their instincts haven't betrayed them. The snow is clearing at last. A heat haze shimmers over the tundra. But the daytime heat is deceptive, and overnight it freezes hard again. The amazing thing is how quickly the colony settles down. One reason is that the geese don't have to look for a mate on arrival. They mate for life. Newlyweds have done their courting on the final stages of the journey north, while they were waiting for the snow to clear. The pairs fly around looking for a nesting site. There are still domestic problems to be sorted out. House hunting, for instance, and squabbles with future neighbours. Each pair has to establish its nesting territory. This particular blue goose seems to have problems with everyone. But finally they all find somewhere to live, and egg-laying starts straight away. In the Arctic, the snow geese have few enemies. It's one of the reasons why they fly thousands of miles to the tundra to nest. But sandhill cranes are certainly a menace. They're very partial to snow goose eggs. A snow goose colony loses about 10% of its eggs. And it's not only the sandhill cranes who do the damage. This is an Arctic skua, a real bandit of a bird, who not only takes eggs but chicks. But then skuas have got to live too. They're nesting close by, and they'll soon have hungry young of their own to feed. Herring gulls seldom miss the chance of an egg, and are always on the watch for an unguarded goose nest. But despite the casualties, an amazing number of eggs survive. Each female broods an average of about 5 eggs for just over 3 weeks. The goslings hatch out pretty much all together. They're active and independent little characters right from the start. As soon as the goslings are dry, the mother leads them away from the nest, which no longer serves any purpose. She takes them out onto the open tundra towards the river. The youngsters feed hungrily. There's often one who's greedier and liable to get left behind. They're bound by very strong family ties. But what about Tail End Charlie? He's bound to end up in trouble. Trouble in his case comes in the form of a pair of sandhill cranes who have a nest nearby. That's why they're so aggressive. Both snow geese parents gallantly defend their young. But the cranes don't give up easily. Besides, a gosling makes a nourishing snack. Ah, there goes Charlie. But no, the cranes dropped him, thanks to his parents' courage. The battle will only end when the snow geese have cleared the cranes' territory. Now the family is reunited. But Tail End Charlie never learns. He's so busy feeding, he stumbles over a tiny semi-palmated sandpiper sitting on her nest. He's really hurrying to catch up now, right through a covey of willow ptarmigan. The thawing tundra has made a maze of pools. It's one of the things that makes it an ideal nesting place for waterfowl. The snow goose family is ready for its first swim. But of course, Tail End Charlie has to be taking a drink. It was thirsty work dodging those sandhill cranes. The rest of the family joins the swimming party in the McConnell River. But Charlie's late again. When the little flotilla reaches a rock in midstream, the rest of the family swims round it, one way or the other. But Tail End Charlie once again has his own solution to the problem. He's just one of those geese who does things differently. Anyone with that amount of character deserves to succeed, and perhaps become a great leader among snow geese on their long migrations. In a colony of 200,000 snow geese, there are bound to be waifs and strays, often those who've hatched late and aren't ready to leave the nest with the rest of the family. The Bartletts couldn't bear to leave all these abandoned youngsters to die of cold and starvation. So they set about rescuing those who seemed to have some chance of survival. These included both blue and white goslings. Now, whenever they moved about the tundra filming, they had to take the orphans with them. When the goslings were very small, the easiest way to carry them was in a cardboard box. One of the fascinating things about orphan goslings is that they quickly attach themselves to people. Movement and human speech seem to attract them. They gradually become convinced that the humans are their real parents. Scientists call this process imprinting. So very soon the Bartletts found that they'd imprinted a dozen permanent additions to their family. Now they couldn't do a thing round the campsite without the geese joining in. When they set off on photographic trips, of course the goslings had to come along too, just as they'd have followed their real snow goose parents. Mosquitoes can make summer on the tundra a perfect misery. The goslings repaid the Bartletts' kindness by helping to keep the numbers of hungry mozzies in check. At a month old, the youngsters were nearly ready to fly and spent a good deal of their time preening their fast-growing flight feathers. They also pulled at Des Bartlett's waders in play, practice for pulling up roots, perhaps. The orphans were willing to help with all the domestic chores, particularly when wash day came around. If the goslings mistook the Bartletts for their parents, what on earth were they to make of another member of the family whom they'd adopted on an earlier northern expedition, a sandhill crane called Fred? Fred helped demolish another tundra pest, the fiercely biting horseflies. When the orphans were 6 weeks old, Des and Jen gave their goose children elementary taxiing and take-off lessons. The young geese in the wild flocks were now down at the coast, but the orphans hung around the camp quite happily. There was now no doubt that the Bartletts were stuck with their goose children. When the wild geese migrated south, the orphans would somehow have to travel as part of the Bartlett household. Young geese rely entirely on their parents to lead them on the 2,500-mile journey southwards. Des and Jen were the only parents the orphans knew and could look up to for leadership. If the Bartlett's geese hadn't yet gained their full powers of flight, the wild geese around the McConnell River had entirely lost theirs. Shortly after they've finished nesting, all the adult geese on the tundra molt their flight feathers in preparation for growing a new set. The adults can't fly, and their young haven't yet learnt to. It's a great opportunity for the small party of scientists who have a base on the McConnell River to round up the geese so that they can mark as many as possible. Some have been marked already with red collars in previous years. The first move is to get the geese into the river. This isn't too difficult. Being flightless, they feel safer on water. The roundup involves about 5,000 geese all told, Canadas as well as blues and snows. The roundup can be a wettish time for scientists. Once they're close to the banding pens, the geese have to be persuaded to take to dry land again. The dark birds in the foreground are mostly this year's young. The scientists will be especially interested in the birds that have been caught before, the ones with neck collars and rings. It all helps to build up a picture of snow goose movement. Right now, the only movement they're interested in is the one that will take the geese into the pen. One has to remember that getting personal records of these geese as they pass along their migration flyway is absolutely vital to the survival of their species.
68, yes.
By August, the young snow geese out on the tundra are nearly full size. They've moved away from the nesting grounds. There's plenty of food for them. The tundra grasses and wildflowers are at their richest. The youngsters can pick and choose from the choicest titbits all around them. Now's the time when they get their basic flying training. Like most student pilots, their landings are a bit bumpy. Their airfields contain certain hazards to navigation too, like this caribou sporting in the brief Arctic sunshine. They quickly become more and more proficient. Their new one flying ability frees them from any serious concern for predators, even one as large and potentially hostile as this. The young geese preen and splash. By August, they're fully qualified flyers, ready to face the long journey that'll take them south ahead of the coming winter. One day in early September, there's a flicker of white wings over the tundra. The north wind has told the geese it's time to go.
And so southward they point their way, southward they fly away, ahead of the snow. Down from Hudson Bay they seem to fill the sky, flying close together, racing very high. It's goodbye to the tundra bay, soar through the freezing air, searching for sun. Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry of gladness. Many miles to travel through the day and night, heading for the Southland, ever on your flight, fleeing from the north wind, down across the states, down to where the sun shines. That's where my love waits, that's where my love waits. Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry, flying home to me.
Year after year, the geese who nest round Hudson Bay follow the same route, just like an airline. It's called the Central Flyway, and it reaches down through the Dakotas and Oklahoma to Texas and the Gulf Coast. Geese are international air travelers, without need for passports or customs formalities. It isn't quite as simple as that for human travelers, as the Bartlett family found out. Now they had another family traveling with them, their orphaned snow and blue geese. As they drove towards the US border, the geese were riding in a specially constructed trailer. The Bartletts hadn't anticipated any trouble in getting the geese across. They'd got the necessary health permits, but the US customs authorities are nothing if not thorough, and the regulations aren't exactly specific about trailer-borne snow geese entering the United States. Jen Bartlett and her young nephew Les got out to declare the contents of that trailer to the US border inspection. Des Bartlett positioned the ladder so that the geese could climb down and make themselves known. The customs men were interested, but not particularly impressed. The Bartletts pointed to the wild snow geese winging their way in thousands southwards overhead.
Come on, fellas.
The customs men said, reasonably enough, that they had no control over wild geese. They enjoyed a different status. They were airborne. But even customs men are human, and when Des suggested that he could get his own geese airborne, they raised no objection. The geese took off, but as everyone watched, they headed northwards, straight back into Canada. The customs men watched them go, as if to say, well, that's too bad, but at least it settles the problem. Now they don't need an entry permit.
Going the right way?
But the Bartletts weren't worried. At least they were cleared to drive over the border.
Looks as though they're going off up north again.
They got back into their cars, without the geese, and drove a few hundred yards into North Dakota. For a little while, the geese kept flying northwards. But then gradually they swung round and headed back south again towards the United States. The Bartletts parked by the side of the highway. Their orphans had crossed the border, flying exactly like their wild relatives, and in a few moments they'd landed beside the cars. Jen looked fondly at the truants as Les helped shoo them back up the ladder into the trailer again.
Come on, fellas, in you go. In you go. Come on, you creeps, up the ladder. Come on, come on.
At last they were all safely aboard. In fairness to the warm-hearted men of the US Customs, there's a postscript to this story. When the Bartletts turned round and drove back to say goodbye, the border officials gave the geese full clearance and asked the Bartletts for their autographs. It's 1,000 miles from Hudson Bay to the US border. It's a further 300 miles to the first main staging point on the Central Flyway, Sand Lake Refuge, South Dakota. The Bartletts drove south to catch up with the wild flocks as they flew in. There are few more staggering sights in nature than Sand Lake Refuge when the fall migration of snow geese piles in. As yet, only a fairly small proportion of the birds have arrived. Against a backdrop of fall colours, new arrivals soar into the cornfields that have been specially planted to feed migrant waterfowl. It's only fairly recently that Sand Lake has become such an important stopover for migrating snows. The refuge was started in the 30s for duck journeying south from their nesting grounds on the Canadian prairies. Today, up to 250,000 snow geese virtually take over Sand Lake in the fall and stay until winter catches up with them and pushes them on southward. That many snow geese eat an awful lot of corn. There's always plenty of waste maize left on the ground after the harvester moves on. The geese can hardly be expected to know that the noisy machine is working for their benefit, and soon they take off en masse. blizzard of geese, a blizzard in which every single flake is a bird weighing somewhere close on 5 pounds. You might imagine that you've now seen pretty nearly every snow goose travelling the central flyway this fall. But wait a minute. That immense flock, frightened by the harvester, is heading back to the safety of Sand Lake itself. The harvester has done its work, and now some of the corn is to be put to a very special purpose. A long trail is laid down to encourage the geese to feed in one carefully chosen area. This man's loading a special kind of goose gun, but he's not a hunter. He's a member of the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Lured by the golden runway of grain, the geese start to plane in. There are a lot of greyish young birds among them. They haven't got the caution of their elders, who are more used to the strange, often dangerous ways of men. A lot of mallards there, too. The cannon looks menacing, but it's only loaded with a charge to propel large nets. About 200 snow and blue geese have been caught, but it's done them no harm. For such wild creatures, geese are strangely adaptable. Under the net they stand quietly until the Wildlife Service men release them. Here's the next stage in the migration study, the following of individual birds along the flyway. It helps the biologists to provide for their needs and understand their problems. The great flocks of snow geese stay around at Sand Lake until winter creeps down from the Canadian prairies. By late October, the first snow flurries powder the grasses along the lake shore. The geese won't hang about much longer if the cold weather continues. Blue and snow geese crowd onto water that threatens to turn into ice at the drop of a degree. By November, it's hard to find food. The cornfields are locked in by snow and ice. They're not so much worried by the cold as they are by the lack of food. It's time to head south again.
It would be so nice if they could only stay, but those icy fingers push them on their way. So it's up high above the clouds, leaders all calling loud, keep moving on. And they shape their skeins into those flying V's. and they cross the land to flee the chilly breeze. For the autumn is passing soon, winter is on the moon. Oh, where is home? Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me. Wing through the sky and let me hear your cry of gladness. Many miles to travel through the day and night, heading for the Southland, ever on your flight. Fleeing from the north wind, down across the states, down to where the sun shines, that's where my love awaits. That's where my love awaits. Fly high and free, fly home, fly south to me. Wing through the sky and let me hear your cry, flying home to me.
Where will they break their journey next after Sand Lake? Some will stop for a while at DeSoto Refuge on the border of Iowa and Nebraska. Others, impelled by the first snows whitening the farmlands far below, will push on further to the refuge at Squaw Creek in Missouri. Driving southwards ahead of the winter, the Bartletts soon found kinder weather. Now their goslings travelled all the time with the back door of their trailer open. At least they got some fresh air that way, though not as much of it as their wild relatives flying thousands of feet overhead. It's over 2,500 miles from Hudson Bay to the Gulf Coast. They're well over halfway now, the V-shaped skeins heading towards Squaw Creek. Years ago, the vast majority of snow geese pressed on towards their wintering grounds on the Gulf Coast. A few still cover the entire 2,000-mile journey practically non-stop. But now that there's a chain of refuges all along the flyway, most break their journey several times, like human air travelers on a long-distance flight. Wings set and paddles lowered as air breaks, the great birds come planing down out of the sky to make another stopover. The Bartletts made a stopover near Squaw Creek too. They'd followed the geese all down the flyway, and just like the birds, they appreciated the first hint of warmer weather. It's been quite a problem throughout the long journey looking after their gosling family. Every day they've been allowed to fly free to exercise their wings. Every day there's been a risk that some would fall to hunters. So far they've only lost one. Well, today in Missouri they plan to give the geese an extra treat. They're going to take them for a swim behind their canoe. They've got another orphan traveling with them, that crazy bird they adopted on a previous trip, and he never likes to be left out of anything. Sandhill cranes don't usually go in for swimming, but Fred is an exceptional bird in almost every way. For a while, the mixed family of snow and blue geese, with Fred bringing up the rear, follow Jen and her nephew Les in the canoe. But their favourite sport is quite definitely flying. They circle round the lake, but at this stage of their lives they never venture far from the Bartletts, whom they still regard as their real parents. One day it will almost certainly be different, and the ties will weaken. But that's something for the future. It happens in all families. Meantime, swimming and flying with their human parents is all that they demand of life. Although Fred can take off from water, he just paddles along behind. Fred has other talents, as you'll shortly find out. Most birds dry themselves by flapping their wings and shaking their feathers. So does Fred, up to a point. But he also likes a sharp rub down with a towel. Not even the Bartletts can say why Fred does this. It's a very strange piece of behavior, even for a hand-reared crane. Although it's late fall, the days are finer now and the sunsets more like those of summer. A good deal of all bird migration takes place at night. Snow geese are especially fine night flyers, navigating by the moon and stars. As the sun goes down, furnace red over Squaw Creek, many of the geese are planning on making a night flight down the last stage of the flyway towards Texas. They'll keep going now, across Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and on towards the Gulf Coast and the rice prairies to the west of Houston. This last stretch of their migration covers about 600 miles. And when the sun comes up after the long night flight, the skeins are still beating along with undiminished power. Snowfall has come to Texas. The blizzard of geese isn't quite as heavy as when they started out. A fifth of their total falls to hunters every year. Yet the Fish and Wildlife Service say that the geese can stand this sort of hunting pressure. They're even on the increase. At last, the Gulf of Mexico lies ahead. They've made it, and the first small parties come whiffling joyously out of the sky. Snow geese love performing aerobatics, especially when losing height. But at the end of the journey, you can't help feeling it looks like a victory roll, and quite possibly it is. If there's one sight that says you're in Texas, it's an oil well. A small skein of snow circles round looking for a landing place. They're not put off by an oil pump or two. It's the farmland they want. Many of the coastal marshes where they once spent the winter have been spoiled for them by drainage and disturbance. On the rich farmland they can find rice, grain and short sweet grass, even a wildflower or two. These are young birds, born a few months back on the tundra and led all the way to Texas by their parents. For old and young, there's a land of plenty to be enjoyed among the Texas rice fields and cattle ranches. Julie, the Bartlett's daughter, joins them during school holidays. The Bartletts realize that when spring comes, their geese may leave them to join up with the wild flocks. They're so tame, they've learnt to fly behind the station wagon now. It's an ideal opportunity to shoot some portraits while the family is still together. A raving individualist, Fred, the sandhill crane, likes to do his own thing behind a bicycle. The wild snow goose flocks have stayed contentedly down south all winter, and the Bartlett's orphans have been quite contented too. But in March, the wild snows begin to get restless. The urge to go north again is tugging at their hearts. So now, when Des and Jen take their geese out for exercise, they feel a tug at their hearts too. They want the geese to return to the wild, but know that they'll be broken-hearted when it happens. In the background, the wild geese talk insistently to each other, heralding the journey they'll soon be making back to Hudson Bay. The Bartlett's geese seem to have become aware of this new restlessness. Could today be the day on which they break the ties that hold them to their human foster parents? The Bartletts have adopted many young animals, yet the snow geese have been something magically different, perhaps because the geese have had the power to leave at any moment, but until now they've never claimed their privilege. The wild geese become more and more clamorous, and suddenly the orphans are on the wing. They begin a wide circle around the cars, as they've done many times before. Then they make a second circuit, a little further away. And this time, when they fly over the cars, some seem to dip, almost in salute, outlined against the cold blue of the spring sky, where the north wind calls to them. Maybe this time they've really gone for good. The wild flocks taking off on spring migration all along the flyway will be the magnet that finally draws them north and convinces them that they are, after all, snow geese and not human beings.
Fly high and free, fly north away from me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry of goodbye. Many miles to travel through the day and night, heading for the Northland, ever on your flight, fleeing from the south wind, up across the states, far from where your heart's been. That's where I shall wait, that's where I shall wait. Fly high and free, fly north away from me, wing through the sky, and let me hear your cry, flying for